Hello and happy September for the latest edition of Geick's Got Game. I'm your host, Matt Geica, here in Millvale and live in the flesh at the River's Edge Studios. You can find our 24/7 live stream at riversedgepgh.com. It is September, which technically begins the season of fall, autumn, which arrives, meteorologically speaking, somewhere around the 21st, the 22nd. Some people, though, consider fall to have already begun when the calendar shifts over. So if you're one of those people, I think you're maybe jumping the gun a little bit. Clearly, I'm still embracing summer with my bright attire. Don't judge. Last day of a road trip. Just got back to Pittsburgh, in fact, from a Midwestern swing for the Pirates. I cover the Pirates for DKPittsburghSports.com, and the Buccos were in Milwaukee for 4, where they won all 4, and then Chicago for 3, where they lost all 3. So a fairly clean and tidy narrative from that perspective. But it was an 8-day trip, as it turns out. My wife joined me in Chicago for the final 3 days. We made a pit stop in her native Michigan, and I only packed for 7 days. So this is what's left, what you see me wearing right now. And so I hope the shirt is bright enough for you to see here if you're watching on the video feed. If you're just listening, you have no idea what I'm talking about, and so you can completely disregard the opening couple of minutes of today's show. Coming up in the next hour or so, we've got some talk about baseball, as you might imagine, with my job and also winding down to the final month of the regular season, and in particular how that applies to the Pirates, who are in playoff contention, but not in a playoff position for the first time in 4 years at this point of the season. So much discussion with that coming up ahead, including how some people are very eager, some fans, some members of the media, very eager to declare the season over. And this isn't exclusive to baseball. It isn't exclusive to the Pirates. But it is something that I've always wondered why people are so eager to jump the gun and say, well, this is it. That's it. We'll call the season over now and move on from there. I'm not sure what that desire is. I'll get into maybe why that is such a habit that we have, those of us who follow sports, in just a little bit. But as a preview for the rest of the show, my expert witness, if you will, stepping in over the phone, joining me as a guest will be my good friend Zac Weiss, who covers the Pirates for PittsburghSportingNews.com, also a golf reporter for the Did You See That network. And he was recently out in Columbus, Ohio for the U.S. Senior Open. He has covered several PGA Tour stops as well. So it's still the season of golf. The FedEx Cup is going on, the postseason on the PGA Tour. And so we'll get into that in addition to some pop culture topics. Zac is a very diverse person in terms of interests. It's not just about sports with him. He does not hashtag stick to sports, as we've talked about in the past. I don't care for that expression very much. And because of that, Zac is one of my favorite people to talk about a variety of topics outside of just our little realm in the sporting community. Also, later on in the show, I wrote something for DK Pittsburgh Sports about projections and the use of them. And we're so obsessed in this world with predictions and what's going to happen in the future. And that's all well and good, but I think at times that can also be misguided. And I will go into greater detail in the third period of today's show. And finally, at the end of the hour, we'll have our final number and ban the cliche as part of my closing arguments. But first, before all that, getting back to what I opened with, not about the trip and not packing enough clothes, but the thing right after that, about the Pirates season. And as we start September, and as they begin a 10-game homestand against NL Central opponents and the Brewers, the Cardinals, and the Reds, they look at 31 games to go and a 2.5-game deficit in the National League wild card hunt. And they just came back from that topsy-turvy road trip. It was an insane August in that way. On a grand scale this year for the Pirates, it has been about bouncing back, as they had a horrific June, going 6-20 over a span in that portion of the calendar that put them in the long shot category to make the playoffs. And they've risen as high as about 35, 36% in terms of playoff probability, according to various projection models. And yes, we'll get into that a little bit later, the merits of those. But I do take them at face value, and I do look at them as a way to form and spin a narrative. And the Pirates have been trying to dig out of that hole ever since June ended. And sometimes they have been rather successful. As I mentioned, they've risen as high as getting close to 40%, so that's reasonable. They have had huge successes in the month of August in particular. They went out west, went 5-1 against Los Angeles and Chicago, or pardon me, Los Angeles and San Francisco. They, as I mentioned, swept 4 from the Milwaukee Brewers in Miller Park, a place that has been just horrific to them over the years, the last decade, more intensely than the first 5 years of that ballpark. But they've played .250 ball, basically, a .250 winning percentage in Miller Park until this past weekend when they swept all 4 and did what a team that has playoff aspirations should do to a squad like the Brewers that is rebuilding and trying out new, younger players and seeing how that all works. So they're not terribly concerned with performance. And so the Pirates did that. It looked like they were finally on the upswing permanently. But of course, you go into Wrigley Field, the home of the best team in baseball, the Chicago Cubs, on pace for 100-plus wins. And the Cubs took care of the Pirates again, knocking them back down to below 20% in terms of playoff probability. So, as you might imagine, after such a downer following such an upper for the Pirates, and that's been the case this month as I've gone over, it's been really an echocardiogram type of a shape to the fifth month out of 6 in the regular season. I get the desire from the fan perspective, from the media perspective, to say, well, this team just doesn't have it. I get it, especially from the fans' side of things, because there's a desire to detach emotionally before you get hurt more than you already are. And I think Pirates fans have felt like this team has gotten their hopes up both at the start of the season when it began the year 28-19, and then since the All-Star break, it's shown signs of life, big-time signs of life, as I've mentioned. But it has ultimately settled very quickly after those rises. And as a fan, you devote your energy, you devote your time to a team, and you also get invested, as I said, and you don't want to invest too much and lose too much. You don't want to get hurt when you don't have to. That is certainly applicable in other areas of life, but also as a sports fan. So that's the one part of saying, well, season's over, that I can certainly get. But there's also another side of it that I think is a little darker, more cynical. There's a desire to be the smartest person in the room, the one who could say, I told you so, at the end of the season. And this is something I don't care for at all. And there's nothing wrong with calling it like you see it. If you don't think they're going to make the playoffs, that's fine. But when a person relishes in discouraging others, their peers in the fan group, I think that's when it crosses the line. It gets mean-spirited, to be honest with you. And that's the way I see it. There's also a general feeling, part of human nature perhaps, that it's not cool to believe in a team that may not make it. If you put yourself out there, there's always the chance that someone will use that against you, and that's even more of the case now when so much of our interaction and communication with others is in the public sphere. Social media is what I'm talking about. When you put out something that is on the positive side, there's always going to be another person out there, seemingly, that wants to knock it down, that wants you to feel bad about yourself for caring about something, and that's a really dark way to go through life. I've never been one to buy into that line of thinking. And I think, again, it goes back to what I was talking about before, the need to not be hurt, to not risk anything. And that's a heck of a boring way to live, number one, but also not a very fulfilling way to live. If you never go for anything, if you never believe in anything, then you're never going to be able to have that sense of accomplishment at the end. And maybe some people can have it both ways. Maybe they can say, okay, the Pirates aren't going anywhere, but they'll still watch and they'll still secretly be fans. So this could all be a front for what they truly believe. But if you really do believe that they're not going to make it, then don't watch the rest of the season. Shut it off. We don't want to hear from you anymore because it is ultimately annoying from a media standpoint now that I have when you see people say, that's it, write them off. And then that same person 5 days later says, oh, what do you think their chances are to make the playoffs? Well, no, I thought you got off the bandwagon. So you have to make a call one way or the other, at least in my mind. Those are the rules that I would have, at least. And you don't have to follow them, but that's the way I feel about it. And as for the Pirates as a team, who this segment was ostensibly supposed to be about, this opening argument to Geick Scott game this week, the season isn't over. As I mentioned, 2.5 games out, and are right there with the New York Mets, staring at the St. Louis Cardinals, the San Francisco Giants, the two teams in those wild card positions. The Pirates aren't going to win their division. That was already the case at the All-Star break when they couldn't sweep the Cubs. I believe they were 7 out at that point. Now it's 16.5 after getting swept at Wrigley Field. So that is about that. And the Cubs are going to win the division. They're going to be the favorite going into the playoffs. Nothing the Pirates can do about it. But they can get in, and they can be the team that the Cubs were last year when they rode into PNC Park and won a winner-take-all game to make the National League Division Series. They could be the San Francisco Giants of 2 years ago, who did the same thing. They could be the Pirates of 2013, who won the wild card at home and went on to give the Cardinals all they wanted in the National League Division Series. Certainly not an outstanding team, I would say, but a team that is good enough to make the playoffs, especially the way that the National League is slightly or significantly diluted, no matter how you might look at it. I think teams like the Mets and the Pirates should be a little bit higher than they are in the standings, consider the talent and the track records that they've had in the past. Heck, the Mets made it to the World Series last year. And even though they were not in a great spot at the end of July 2015, they pushed to the finish line hard. They accomplished more than the Pirates have in the postseason over the past 2 decades plus in order to get all the way to the World Series. So they're on the outside. So is Pittsburgh. I kind of think both teams are better off, better positioned than the Cardinals. But St. Louis, give them credit, they're hanging in there and making it difficult for a team like the Pirates, who cannot put together a solid week at a time even. It seems like outside of that California trip, it has been a series of triumphs followed by disappointments. Yeah, that's baseball. There are 162 results built in to each regular season, but the way the Pirates are playing makes it difficult to take their postseason goals and aspirations very seriously. Every time they make a push, they fall back. This isn't advanced analytics. This is just what's happened, and it's more of a marvel from my standpoint that they've been unable to really tear off a nice run of 2 weeks, of 3 weeks of good ball, because I think they are capable. The way that the pitching staff has come together, the way that I think this lineup still has the potential to score more runs than it has. The trend was more grand in the first half, good for about 2 months, then bad for about 6 weeks. But now it's extreme and micro. We're going up and down much more quickly. It's whiplash-inducing, one might say, as I wrote on DK Pittsburgh Sports for my Matt Stats feature this Thursday. The Pirates are in it, but after going to Wrigley Field and seeing the fervor and seeing the talent of the Cubs firsthand once again, they're not in it like the Cubs are in it, but we also know that the best team doesn't always win. In fact, the best team doesn't win the majority of the time in baseball and football and hockey. No matter what. Neil Huntington has discussed the importance of being the hottest team going into the playoffs. I don't know how much you can actually control that. I don't think you can control that at all. That seems to be a very random thing. But what you can control is, at least as a team, playing with full urgency, full intensity. I'm seeing that from the Pirates. They're not as good as the Cubs, but every other team coming up down the stretch, with the exception of the Nationals on their schedule, I think they are at least on level terms with. So your guess is as good as mine as to why they haven't had a sustained run of success. In August, it's been weird. It's been different. And we could say that they were unlucky to not win at least 1 or 2 on this recent trip to Wrigley Field. But here we are. Write them off if you want. I'm not willing to do that so far to this point. Still 1 month to go. And as Ryan Vogelsong, a guy who has some experience in the postseason, said recently, you're always surprised how much baseball is left to play in September. And at the very least, after a season of tumult, a season of criticism for Neil Huntington, for Clint Hurdle, for the players in some cases like Andrew McCutchen and Garrett Cole, the Pirates are in a spot that might be surprising because they are there. And despite being a low-revenue, low-spending team and some of their key cogs not clicking along as we imagined, they are in position as September begins. And so that means fun and meaningful baseball, at the very least, in Pittsburgh for, well, really, if you go back, the 5th consecutive year, counting 2012. They did collapse that year, but they were in a spot, much like they are this time, to climb into that postseason position. We'll take a break on Geick's Got Game and come on back with our featured guest, Zac Weiss. We'll talk some baseball, some golf, but also go far afield in his, I believe, 3rd visit to the program in about 13 months. So always good to chat with him. We'll bring him aboard after this break on The River's Edge.
Hi, I'm Mike Storer, host of the Awesome Cast, which you can hear right here on River's Edge Radio. We're talking tech, getting geeky every week with people from Pittsburgh in the industry. Go check us out, awesomecast.net, or listen to us right here on River's Edge Radio, Thursday mornings, 8 a.m. after Funny Money.
And welcome back. Second segment time on Geick's Got Game for this September 2nd, 2016. And please welcome to the show for what I believe is the 3rd time. He'll have to confirm for me, but his name is Zac Weiss. He is our expert witness for this week. Pirates reporter for PittsburghSportingNews.com. Also covers a lot of golf for the Did You See That network, and always enjoy his perspective on that sport too. One of my favorites as well. And as I mentioned in the previous segment, not afraid to talk about essentially anything under the sun. So, Zac, thank you for joining me.
Absolutely, Matt. This is the 3rd time, and hopefully the 3rd time is the charm. Hopefully I get it right this time.
Yeah, we'll see about that. We'll see how you do. First of all, the baseball side of things. You have been at PNC Park, as you were last year, for Pittsburgh Sporting News. And you come from a perspective that I can relate to as well, because both of us grew up in Pittsburgh and now covering teams from the area. What have you gleaned from the experience of covering the Pirates that maybe has surprised you about the sport of baseball, about the team, about anything that might come to mind?
I wouldn't say necessarily anything surprises me. I consider myself someone that doesn't get easily surprised by much.
Okay.
I just remember the childhood memories of sitting at PNC Park with my father. It was the christening of Mazeroski Way when the Pirates played I believe the San Diego Padres, and that was the first game in which I kept score. So really that's one of my first baseball memories, that and the six-fingered Antonio Alfonseca. But there's only so much that you can do there. Baseball-wise, there's not really too much that surprises me. The press access, I think, from a Pirates perspective, and one that I believe you can agree with as well, has been very, very nice, and the players have, for the most part, been rather accessible and easy to talk to. So I wouldn't say that there's much that surprises me. Maybe how poor Clint Hurdle has to talk to us all maybe 2 or 3 times a day. But other than that, I don't really say that much has surprised me, to be honest with you.
It is a lot. I'm glad you brought that up about managerial availabilities. It amounts to more than 300 times a year. So that is a little different compared to football, especially where you get the head coach, once a week. So that is quite the disparity. But what is it about baseball that made you want to do this and made you want to get into it?
Well, baseball in itself, I was the kid that thought he could be an athlete and play Little League. It ended up that I was the guy that got hit by the pitches and could hit a ball a foot and be safe. I was that kind of guy. So even since I was young, it was one of the sports that caught my eye. It was something that was relatable even when I was young. I was a Ken Griffey Jr. fan when I was little, and the way that he played the game in so many different facets and had such domination in the game, and again, so many different facets. Something which really caught my eye early on when I was younger. obviously myself being 24, Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey Jr. when you were young? Yes, it is Ken Griffey Jr. Guys, that was the guy that really turned me on to the game of baseball, and just the way that he went about it, the attitude he had on and off the field was something that was really attractive, and it really piqued my interest from there. To be honest, basketball and golf were actually the first two sports that I grew up with. My great-grandfather, who unfortunately has passed away years ago, was the one that taught me those two sports. But baseball was the third one I learned, and really those are the three sports that I'm most passionate about.
Now, with baseball, one of the things I enjoy about your coverage at Pittsburgh Sporting News is that you don't do the usual story. You tend to go into the human interest side, into the behind the game side, even discussing the bullpen catchers, for instance, Joe Klimchak as well, the in-game host at PNC Park. I believe you talked to Joe Torre last year for a story too. So you mix it up. What was maybe your favorite story that you've done so far for PSN?
I just think my favorite moment is Jimmy T, the Jim Trudinich, the Pirates media relations savvy, the one that makes sure that we're all in line and watches our coverage. And frankly, him and Dan Hart give us credentials and do a great job. He came up to me last homestand and said, "You always go with the obscure angle, don't you?" And I said, "It's what makes the job fun." And he smiled and laughed and ended up getting me who I needed to right after that. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that, whether it's Jordan Comedina, the now backup bullpen catcher on the Pirates, Kevin Young last homestand. Those were really, really fun. But I think the human interest in those little facets are something that you don't necessarily get, whether it's for time commitments. Everybody has a schedule that they have to get to. And again, the joy of being an online outlet, I don't necessarily have that very same schedule. So it makes it a touch more easier for me to find those niche stories, whether it's seeking out Joe Torre in the back of a press box, standing borderline stalker, like from a 20 to 30-minute perspective, trying to get an interview. Whatever the case is, if it's a story that's worth digging, I don't mind doing the work if it creates a story that I think will be of intrigue to my readers and the Pittsburgh Sporting News audience. And I would like to think that I've been successful in that regard.
There is an element of journalism that is related to stalking, and it's a little different. It is something you have to get used to, but I find it, as you do too, that the wait is usually worth it in that way, because not everyone is willing to wait or willing to think in a new way. And in a big market too, you want to differentiate yourself. That's something I'm constantly thinking about for DKPS, and I know that you're the same with that. I want to get into your golf coverage, and it is dystnow.com that you write for. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and I also will be covering Pitt football for them as well.
Oh, there you have it. So we'll branch out. We'll get into that in just a moment. But the golf thing is intriguing for me. You've often expressed your enjoyment of covering the game. You mentioned the family connection there. I had a similar thing with my grandfather who introduced me to the game. I find that is a very common thread among golf fans, golfers in general, who often cross over into the golf fan area too. One of those sports in that way that if you play it, you're almost automatically a fan of it at the highest level. But how is golf different for those who don't know to cover, to get inside of, compared to some of the other, I guess you would call them, the major professional team sports?
In some areas, I would say it's easier. In some areas, I would think that it would be harder. And I guess what I mean by that is you have the press access, and I would say the golfers themselves are more accessible than the major athletes in any sport in terms of getting them.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily get Andrew McCutcheon every single day by his locker, or not necessarily want to talk to them. Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson probably want a restraining order against the media at this point with all the post-round press conferences they have to do. But it comes with the territory. With that being said, it's also harder to forge the relationships with the guys because they're being force-fed to throngs and throngs of golf media. Whereas in baseball, it's much more likely that you're going to forge that relationship with that player or get that one-on-one or quick quote that you need. It's so much tougher in golf. Sometimes if a guy isn't doing as well or you want to get a quick quote, it's easy. But if you're talking to a Jordan Spieth or a Rory McIlroy or a Jason Day or even on the senior tour, Bernhard Langer or Colin Montgomery, it's all the more harder because they're being brought on a regular basis. So you're trying to get the angles, obviously, as you know, but I'm sure people are not as well aware. I'm friends with David Frost and Kenny Perry, and they're guys in the champ that have very much accomplished PGA Tour careers and have also had some success in the Champions Tour. It's about forging those relationships, and it's not as easy to do in golf, but it's so much more rewarding, and I consider it such an enjoyable experience. First of all, it's the outdoors. You get to walk
Yes.
outdoors. The inside the ropes access, if you get it, which is very tough to get depending, is very, very enjoyable. You get to walk inside the ropes, and you can kind of go at your own pace as long as you obviously respect the players on the course and their shots and stay within the arm's length. But I guess that's a quick synopsis of what makes it easier and what makes it harder. But overall, it's just a good mix of fun, and it's rather loose. Most of the guys are rather easygoing, and it makes the job much easier.
Zac Weiss, all-around sports reporter, joins me on Geik Scott Game for right now. And Zach just, of course, told you that he's going to be covering Pitt football, Pat Narduzzi's second season in Oakland. And, well, conveniently enough, Zach, I didn't even plan on this connection, but Pitt opens up against Villanova on Saturday. And so there you have it. James Conner's return to the field. Everyone will be watching that. And we're all eagerly anticipating seeing him back in action after... Well, first of all, people almost forget now he had the knee injury that knocked him out for the year. And then, of course, he had the diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma. So he had two major issues to deal with. One, of course, much more easily healed than the other. But he's gotten through the cancer. And from what I have read and seen, Zach, on some people's coverage, he is at least close to the guy that he was before he suffered the injury against Youngstown State in last year's opener. But that's the above-the-radar story. But what are you looking forward to this fall and winter from covering Pitt? What do you think is the most interesting storyline or storylines that could happen?
I think there's obviously some uncertainty that goes on with Pitt. I think that a lot of people have, from an expert perspective, have the expectation a little bit lower than what I think Pitt will finish. I think Pitt has the potential to be an 8 or 9 win team this season. What I like, and this could be a complete cop-out, forgive me for that, is the fact that there's consistency at the quarterback position with Nathan Peterman. I think that obviously the depth behind him is not necessarily what Pitt would want, but Peterman's consistent. He's a good leader, and I really think that he's got a lot of fire and can bring a lot to the team this season. And additionally, I think Pat Narduzzi obviously had the big experience with Michigan State, but this is his second go-around in ACC play, and I think he's probably learned things probably more than he's talked about with the press from last season, and how he translates it into this season will be interesting. But I'm looking forward to Pitt maybe exceeding the expectations of some of the bigger names and some of the bigger publications, and we'll obviously see where it goes forward. Everybody's already looking to a week from Saturday with Penn State, but Villanova, you have to win that game. First of all, obviously it'd be embarrassing from a Pitt perspective to lose that game, but you don't want to get caught looking ahead at Penn State, and so far it seems like the guys are saying the right things. Well, I guess we'll find out Saturday how that goes.
Yes, Pitt-Penn State down the line, but Pitt has a game prior to that, as we mentioned, against Villanova, and that will be the opener of another Pitt season at Heinz Field, and that the Heinz Field thing, we're all wondering who will show up in greater numbers for that Pitt-Penn State matchup. Do you have a feel for that at all, Zach, what we're going to see in terms of atmosphere for the renewal of that rivalry?
Well, I'm not Joe DiNardo, the former TAE weatherman or anything like that, but I think Pitt would like to think that it has the majority of the fans, and I guess it's a matter of believing it when you see it. You can kind of maybe gauge how things will be based on Saturday. And if fans will stay in their seats past the third quarter and sleep in, we'll see how that goes. That's obviously a big story in itself. So it's tough to get up for those opening games when it's a Villanova, when it's maybe even a Youngstown State, though it had some proximity to Heinz Field. So I guess we'll see how it goes. I hear season tickets have been are very, very strong, and obviously I'm sure some of that's motivated by that Penn State matchup. So we'll see what the turnout is from students and season ticket holder members alike on Saturday.
I'm looking forward to the uniforms. I love the bright blue and the bright gold. I've discussed that on this program in the past. Not only is this Pat Narduzzi's second year, but it's also athletic director Scott Barnes' second football season, so to speak. So putting his mark on the program, going away from the more washed out navy blue and the metallic gold, returning to the colors that made Pitt famous back when it was challenging for national championships. Of course, Dan Marino and Johnny Majors and all that. So that is the connection that Pitt hopes that people will make when fans watch them in those new duds. Well, Zach, as I mentioned when I introduced you, it's not all about sports. And when you and I sit next to one another in the PNC Park press box, typically not at all about sports. In fact, not at all about baseball. But one thing that is connected is walk-up songs in baseball. That's what usually gets us talking about music. So we'll go there first. And so that's an interesting part of the game and something that we often comment on when we're up there watching the game play out in front of us. But as for you, I often get this question. What would your walk-up song be? Maybe a cliched question for a baseball reporter, but I'm interested in your answer.
Jokingly, I believe that I said in the press box, Gilbert O'Sullivan, Alone Again Naturally, because I'm mostly single.
God. That's right. I forgot about that.
Might as well. I would probably choose something that would, whether I don't care if it really amuses anybody else. Let's just go with Baha Men Who Let the Dogs Out. That's that's what I'm feeling right now. And then maybe something Zumba-y or maybe something upbeat that might be a little would be something Latin. Maybe even Don Omar Zumba would be the second time coming around. It's got a good beat. Maybe get the fans into it.
Wow. Okay. What's in your iPod right now, by the way?
Or
your music player. I don't want to be brand, conscious. Go ahead. Sorry.
74 hours of music. Pretty much anything 50s till today, and pretty much any single genre you can imagine.
Wow, I like that. I like that a lot. Are you, by the way, a wrestling fan? Because you made a wrestling reference in your latest Pirates column for PSN, and it made me wonder, are you one of the many sports reporters out there, mostly male, but one of the many sports reporters out there who do follow the WWE?
Yes, I am. I've met some WWE performers themselves. Obviously, us journalists are allowed to have interests away from the gig, and wrestling is one of those. And my dad definitely has 100% to blame for that.
Really? Okay. Throwing it back to the older days, Bruno Sammartino and whatnot?
No, I think I got caught watching John Cena too many times, and I cringe at hearing that. But
that's okay. I don't really. I'm a terrible person in terms of wrestling knowledge. So, John Cena, I do know his name. I know that.
Yikes! Yeah.
He at one time was quite the thing in wrestling. Also, you made an interesting comment to me the other day. Do you watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette? Are you all over that?
Full credit to my mom. Yes, I am guilty of this, and no, I would not want to go on that show, and I have no interest in finding love, especially in that manner. That would be putting my life out there to millions and millions of people. I'll just stick to finding love in a more traditional manner.
Like Twitter, right? Tinder.
Absolutely not. What's the negative? Is that swipe left or swipe right? Whatever the negative is to that.
I'm very glad I don't know which way you swipe. One of my good friends swears by it, though. So, and he's with his significant other for several months now. So maybe it could be a possibility. Don't want to rule it out.
To watching The Bachelor.
Okay. Well, Zach doesn't put his life out there for millions, but he does put it out there for thousands on Twitter. You can find him at Zachary. That's Zachary with his CH in the middle. M. Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. And if you're not interested in any of the other nonsense we've been talking about, like I mentioned, he does cover the Pirates. He covers golf and Pitt football, as I mentioned. And you've been all over the Duquesne basketball beat, too. So what is your feel on where that program is before we let you go? I know that that's the Glamour program at Duquesne. And speaking of athletic directors, that's the second year. It is the second year coming up for athletic director David Harper over there on the Bluff. So what's your feel for the progress there?
I'm assuming you mean from a men's basketball perspective?
Yes.
Okay.
The women have been great, by the way. We've talked about that on this program, too.
Yes, and they have a very tough non-conference schedule, the toughest in program history. From the men's perspective, though, It's really tough to gauge because you have a lot of the seniors that are gone. I think that the players that are returning are hungry. I think they're still looking for that vocality and voice, and I wouldn't necessarily say a direction, but I think a lot of those seniors were injured last season, and there was a lot of experience gained and a lot of lessons learned from that time last season. And I know that there were some players that were very, very disappointed, but I'm going to turn to Emil Blackman, who is actually a transfer grad student, I believe, that is coming in. And he said, we're playing our hardest defense, and it is only July, which was the time that I got the quote. And if you're a Duquesne fan, I'm sure there's some that say that might be lip service. I mean, how can you really do much defensively when it's against your own guys in July and a hot gym?
Fair, yeah.
But if that's what they're believing, so far I see no reason to deviate from that. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are probably shaking their head, oh, it's typical Duquesne narrative. Where is the defense when it mattered? Sure, that was the case during conference play last season, but if you're encouraged with defensive play at this point in time, and you're trying to find an identity and you're trying to create a defensive identity that maybe has been lacking, at least in the Jim Ferry era, if not more, then I'm at least encouraged. Obviously, the non-conference is what it is. There's a chance to find some momentum there, and I think there could be the potential for a strong non-conference season. It's just a matter of, are they prepared to handle conference season? And with the amount of bodies that are new returning, I'm not quite sure I have that answer quite yet. I don't think anybody does. The cop-out is it's not fair to think that way, but the reality is that it's really tough to gauge a program where a lot of the players coming in either didn't have minutes or are coming in. So I think the honest answer is it's too early to have any expectations, but I think they're doing some good things, and I think that there's a lot on the line for the coaching staff. Maybe I think a lot of fans are very disappointed, and obviously the word fire is being tossed around, let go is being tossed around. I don't think that's fair, but I think what is fair at this point in time is to let these players play and see where it goes. But early signs from the players, at least, are encouraging, and the players that had down years last year are very, very fired up to maybe avenge that season and make a new name for themselves this season.
College, pro, other things. Zac Weiss has you covered. Thank you,
Bachelor.
Zach. Yeah, The Bachelor, right. My wife watches that, and I usually, sometimes I'll sit in and notice what's going on. But leave that as it may. We'll see you at PNC Park, in fact, coming up here, Zach. I appreciate the time.
All right. Thanks, Matt. We've just shamed ourselves, but absolutely my pleasure to be on.
Good stuff from Zach. We'll come on back for the third period of Geig's Got Game after this.
They did leech people up until, like 1910 or so, I think.
How do you know that? Like till 1910 or so.
Well, it's for reading.
I used to get girls till
medical
1910 or so. I used to have girls give me booty calls till 1910 or so.
Hey, Money Bags, tune into Funny Money at 7 a.m. Thursdays.
Did you hear Tom? He said 7 a.m. Tune in.
Third period time on Geig's Got Game. I'm your host, Matt Geica, and thank you again to Zac Weiss for joining for the previous segment. Never know where that's going to go with him, but he is endlessly interesting and amusing, especially in the PNC Park press box. Some of the games get a little long, so Zach's been known to mix it up and keep it fresh. And that's what we'll try to do here on this program each and every week. As I've said in the past, it's an attempt to put a different spin on sports talk, just as the River's Edge itself puts a different spin on radio. Not terrestrial radio, but internet radio, found at riversedgepgh.com. Tom Benoit and I are reunited this week, as he's behind the camera if you're watching. He's producing the program, and always flexible to my weird schedule. As I mentioned, driving all day on Thursday to get back here to Pittsburgh for yet another Pirates homestand. I have to say, Milwaukee is underrated as a city. I think it is overlooked. I don't know why. Maybe because it's 90 miles from Chicago, city center to city center. But you still have Lake Michigan in Milwaukee, and it's much easier to get around. A lot of cool stuff in Chicago. Don't get me wrong. A Wrigley Field chief among them. A cathedral. Absolutely no hyperbole to say it that way. For not just baseball, but for sport in general. However, Milwaukee has many of the quality of life things that I think we all take for granted in Pittsburgh sometimes. And over the past 3 weeks, I've been to some huge cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago on the Pirates beat. And once you get to those ballparks and once you get into those city centers, it is fun. It's great, but it's just a matter of getting in there. And the travel time, the logistical parts of it are stressful for me. I'm one of those guys who stresses out about that type of thing. I don't know why, but I do. But in Pittsburgh, we have traffic. Yes, the tunnels can slow things down. There's construction. There's construction everywhere, but we tend to hype it up a little bit more than most places here in Pittsburgh. However, you can get most places in a reasonable amount of time, and that is not the case in Chicago. I stayed at 9 miles from Wrigley Field, and it took me about 40 minutes each day to get to the ballpark, so that puts it all in perspective. Also with Wrigley, you have to know it's in the middle of a neighborhood. It's not next to a highway, unless you count Lakeshore Drive, which really isn't a major highway in a lot of ways, not an interstate, certainly. So you have to just go through these city blocks and by schools and residences, businesses, everything backing up, trucks making deliveries. Believe me, it's quite the maze to get back there. But once you do, if you haven't been there, you have to go to Wrigley Field. I was standing down there on the playing surface Wednesday afternoon, and it's surreal. It doesn't even look real. It's very much like Dodger Stadium, someplace you've seen on TV so many times. It feels like it's a soundstage somewhere. It's not a legit ballpark, but it really is. I'm here to tell you it exists. It is true. It is tangible. And in many ways, the reality is much better than what you build in your mind when you do watch these games on TV. And I find myself commiserating with Cubs fans. They have suffered through quite a bit, and they are really enjoying having the best team in baseball this year. And boy, are those fans into the game, rising to applaud even during such a seemingly trivial moment as Jake Arrieta fouling off a few pitches against Steven Brault, the Pirates starter, on Monday night. They appreciated how tough it is for a pitcher to hang in there for a long at-bat. They were on their feet giving him a standing O, and you just don't see that in very many places. And honestly, you don't see it in Pittsburgh enough for my taste. Baseball fans aren't as engaged with the baseball here in Pittsburgh. And you can say you had 2 decades of losing, and I'll say yes, that will very much disengage a fan base from the sport and what's going on. The reason that we're there is because they're playing a sport, not because Potato Pete races during the 6th inning stretch. But in Chicago, they've had plenty of heartbreak. And in fact, you might say it's been harder to be a Cubs fan because they have made the playoffs a couple of times, and they've gotten to the precipice. They've gotten to Game 7 of the NLCS in 2003, and one of their own fans, Steve Bartman, steals away a potential win there with a foul ball that he grabbed away from Moises Alou. They've had the near misses that the Pirates haven't really had. Even with the wild card, you could say that, yeah, they've seen that Game 7 atmosphere and they've seen that winner-take-all atmosphere, and they have in Pittsburgh at PNC Park. But they haven't gotten close enough to taste it, and the Cubs fans have. Back in 2007, I think they had one of the best records, if not the best record in baseball. Got knocked out in the first round, so they have had more than their share of that type of sadness and well, I say heartbreak. It sounds hyperbolic, but it's really not. That is, like I mentioned in the opening segment, in our opening argument this week on the show, it's about emotional investment. That's what makes these games meaningful for people. And when you do finally get that payoff after all those years of disappointment, then I'd say it's even sweeter. We'll see if it happens for the Cubs. It hasn't happened yet. It's always easy to say that, like you did with the Red Sox fans back in the day. Anyway, before we take our final break on Gike's Got Game, the cross-examination, something I want to add each week on this show, taking a popular concept in sports and analyzing it and seeing if it's worthwhile. Projections, and I mentioned the Pirates' playoff probabilities in the opening segment of this show, somewhere around 20% right now, a little bit lower depending on which projection models you look at. We all have that desire to see into the future, but is playing out the season, is doing this, is simulating 10,000 seasons and seeing how it goes, as we often do now with the advanced data that we have, with the computing power that we have. That's been a large part of it too. Is that useful at all? Does that tell us anything? It's one thing to say, yes, the Pirates have a 16% chance of making the playoffs, but In the end, it comes down to, do they do it or do they not? What did the 16% do for us besides show us how much of a long shot it was? And I think I appreciate that from a storytelling perspective, but even someone like me who is very data-driven, who likes the tangible evidence, I don't know if I see exactly a reason for saying, in Sports Illustrated, for instance, always before every big season, every website now, but I go back to my childhood and reading Sports Illustrated before the baseball season, before the football season, before the hockey season, and they would always predict who's going to win the championship, who's going to go to the playoffs, what are their records going to be, even going as minute into details as that. What is the point of all that? Is this something that we're going to hold publications accountable for? Should we, even when there's so many things that are unpredictable about sports? Someone that I look up to very much in this business, Nate Silver, data journalist, said in his book, bestseller The Signal and the Noise, a few years ago, that predictions are a crucial part of analysis because we can then match our theories against results in real time. It's kind of like adding some stakes to the theories we have about why things work the way they do. I don't disagree with that, especially because this can help us outsiders appreciate how challenging it is to put together a team from a general manager's perspective, especially, or how to project how a free agent is going to do, or a trade acquisition. How is he going to pan out? Like Ivan Nova, the Pirates picking him up at the trade deadline from the Yankees. He's been good. How did we know that he was going to be good? Well, we didn't really. The Pirates took a bet that he was. So that's where the rubber meets the road on projections, when you have to make these decisions. For all of us on the outside, it's all fun and games, really, comparatively speaking. But dealing in probabilities is a sketchier realm for me. Overall, that's my greater point. Yes, it can help us put a situation in context. Was this an unexpected result, or should we have seen this coming? But saying a team has a 5% shot to win a game in the 8th inning when they're trailing by 4 runs, I think we all intrinsically know that. It's nice to put a number on it, I suppose, to be more exact. I'm all for exactitude, and as I mentioned, tangibility. Or does the team have a 75% probability of making the World Series once they get to a certain point? That's helpful, again, from a narrative standpoint. I'm usually all for that type of data. But in this case, though, I see it as more cheap heat, more getting ways for people to click on your story than anything we can really use. After the fact, yes, projections are helpful, even necessary, to see if the way we understand things, or the way we think we understand things, is accurate. But in my feeling, we're putting too much importance on the projections and the predictions before the fact and saying, well, what do you think about this? How's this going to play out? I was guilty of it. I just asked Zach, well, what's the major storyline for Pitt football? Maybe that was unfair for me, but I think people do enjoy us taking a stab at things and what's going to happen in the future. But for me, I would like to see more of the analysis shifted to after the fact. We tend to just move forward in the sports media culture. Keep moving, spin it forward. What's going to happen after this? Well, no, we need to look back and say, why did this happen? So then we can properly apply that to our concepts of how things happen in the future. And if we just zoom right on by and say, okay, on to the next thing, then we're really missing out on some valuable insight that can be gleaned from studying history. And you all know the hoary phrase, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We say that, but I don't think we take that to heart as often as we should. Let's go to our final break, and when we come back, I'll have our final number, appropriately enough, part of the closing argument on Gike's Got Game. Also, I'll ban a cliche before we step aside for another week on Gike's Got Game.
Hey, everybody out there, this is Mike Sasson, stand-up comedian, broadcaster, all-around great guy. Starting July 19th, guess what you're going to get? That's right, another white guy's opinion. It's the Michael Sasson Show. It's going to be premiering July 19th at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Bring it on back for the closing argument. Overtime on Gike's Got Game. And if you listen to the show, you know I'm a numbers guy. I like to weave numbers into the sports talk, into the analysis, into the perspective whenever I can. And the final number is a good way to do that. Let's go to the number 2 this week, as in what I believe. This is more of an opinion-based numerical argument this week, but hey, no rule against that. I believe that 2 NFL preseason games are what we could get by with as soon as next year. Maybe I've talked about this before on this show 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, with my brother Mark, who is a physical therapist, doctor of physical therapy. We were discussing ways to cut down wear and tear in football and some of the more physical sports. Hockey blows through its preseason. It's over quickly. The NFL, it rolls on, kind of a tradition to go for 5-6 weeks, a couple of weeks out by yourself at training camp. The Steelers do it, of course, at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe. And then you go into the preseason, which can be 4 or even 5 exhibition games. And so many injuries, so many needless blows, not just to the head, but also to the body, that are taken by these players who get beat up enough as it is. 16 regular season games, up to 4 games at playoffs, if you're lucky. I think we can cut the preseason down to 2 and eventually paring it down to maybe even 1 or 0. I believe it was John Harbaugh of the Ravens, in fact. I know he's not a very popular guy in these parts, but he was saying that if college teams can get by with 0 preseason games, why can't pro teams? And if you mandate that everyone does it that way, then everyone in theory is on the same playing field, even though some teams relying more heavily on rookies would disagree. They want to get these guys into the action. They want to see what they can do in game-like scenarios, so on and so forth. I'm not willing to say that 0 is feasible right now, but I think we can slice it in half and have all your starters play a half or 3/4 in one of those preseason games, and in the other, you can do what it's like in the 4th preseason game. Have all the players who are competing for those final spots on the roster get after it and show you what they can do, again, in a game-like setting, as close to regular season as you can generate without real stakes being involved. So I think we can do it in 2. That is my modest proposal, and that is my final number for the week, the number 2. And as for the usual cliche that I try to ban from all existence, it will be more of a concept than a literal phrase. But as the NHL season approaches, and believe me, I'm looking forward to the start of hockey again, even though it's been a short off season if you follow the Penguins, or if you follow hockey at all and you like to see how the season comes to its conclusion in the Stanley Cup final. It's a short off season, and for some people that's a good thing. Hockey junkies like myself, I don't mind it. The World Cup of Hockey is coming up in just a couple of weeks, and so we'll have an even earlier start to the season than usual. But I'm not one to count down the seasons, and I know that teams and leagues are simply doing their jobs, building the hype. It's a big thing on social media, X amount of days until the regular season starts, so on and so forth. But life goes by fast enough. It'll get here, I promise. That's how time works. Eventually, we'll move on from the summer to the fall to the winter. We'll be in hockey season. We don't have to count down the days. It's, again, cheap heat, easy way to build hype. I understand that. But it's just not something that resonates with me. And even when I was working in PR for teams, I would tend to shy away from that too far in advance. Yes, you get within 2 weeks. Yeah, it's time to start getting people excited and ready to go. And that is the time to really look forward to it, especially when you have the preseason begun, exhibition games, easier way to tie in storylines and get people interested. But there's so much going on in the sports world that even though we are told in a lot of ways that there is no off-season anymore, I think there is. I think people are locked in to, for instance, if you're a Pirates fan, baseball. If you are a football fan, training camp is a big deal right now. I don't think there's any real room for hockey on the sporting calendar. I get at this point in the season, or this point in the year, I get that if you work for NHL Network, if you work for a team, you have to gin up something, and there's all of that. But I think we can step away from the countdowns and just let it come when it does. Because downtime, believe it or not, builds the anticipation. And when you step away from something completely and not constantly think about, 10 days to go, 9 days to go, 30 days to go, 2 months to go, whatever it may be, when you completely step away from it, your enthusiasm for it is refreshed. It's the reason why players take a month or 2 months off of their training. Maybe not 2 months anymore, but I think a month is more reasonable. Sidney Crosby recently talked about taking that much time off from his training. Even these guys who make it their livelihoods, they're pouring the most energy and passion and mental basically time thinking about it, psychological energy in addition to physical energy. These are the guys investing the most, and even they step away because they know that it's just the way our bodies and our brains work. We need to take a break and step away. So take it from me, the baseball reporter, off days are precious. And I just enjoyed one on Thursday, even though I was on the road all day. And I'm going to be refreshed because of that. So we don't need to constantly count down to seasons, to games. It will arrive, and we will all be happier for having stepped away from it. I'm about to step away for another week. That's what makes every week in here enjoyable, too, as I get some time to think and come up with ideas and topics for you. Once again, thanks to Zac Weiss for joining me on the program. Thank you, most importantly, for listening each and every week on the River's Edge. It is a true joy. And once again, this is Matt Geica reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. That's a line from a Clark song. They're performing at Ribs Fest this weekend. So I won't be there. I'll be covering the Pirates. But if you are, enjoy. I'll talk to you next week. Have a great weekend.